It is winter in occupied Europe. Somewhere between a road that no longer appears on maps and a forest that swallows sound, a German sentry stands alone under bare branches dusted with snow. His breath rises white in the freezing dark. A rifle hangs heavy across his chest. Around him, nothing moves. No vehicles. No voices. Only the slow creak of trees tightening in the cold. A few meters away, half buried beneath moss and rot, sits an old tree stump. Its hollowed center is charred black, emptied by age and rain. Inside, twisted wires disappear into dirt. A cracked dial, clouded with years of grime, rests at an angle no hand has touched in a long time. To the guard, it is garbage. War scrap. Another useless thing abandoned by people who fled or vanished. He warms his hands, stamps his boots, and looks past it, just wood and silence. He does not hear the thin murmur inside the stump. He does not know the dead machine is alive. And in its quiet heartbeat, the war is being whispered beyond borders. By the time German boots pressed into the mud of Western Europe in 1940, the war was no longer just a contest of armies. It was a war of nervous systems, of nerve centers, signals, whispers, and shadows. France collapsed in weeks. The Netherlands fell in days. Norway in months. Across occupied territory, borders lost their meaning, but patrols multiplied. Uniforms changed. Flags vanished. Laws were rewritten overnight. What did not change was fear. And in that fear, one thing became deadlier than any pistol or hidden grenade. The radio. To the Germans, control meant silence. Not quiet silence with intent. Radios in conquered cities were confiscated or sealed. Private ownership became illegal. Listening to foreign broadcasts could earn imprisonment. Transmission could earn execution. A voice leaving a room was more dangerous than any soldier entering one. A radio, no matter its size, became a weapon in itself. The Gestapo understood this early. The Abwehr refined it. Entire departments emerged dedicated not to combat, but to listening. Direction-finding units, Funkabwehr teams, swept towns with rotating antenna arrays, measuring invisible waves with terrifying accuracy. A radio that lingered too long on a frequency could be mapped. A building could be circled. A knock would follow. And if there was a transmitter inside, survival became unlikely. By 1941, German radio counterintelligence doctrine had matured into machinery. Vans cruised streets with loop antennas on their roofs. Portable detection sets were carried by soldiers through alleyways and staircases. Operators could log a transmission's position within minutes if conditions were clear. The technology was blunt at first, then grew sharp. And fear made it sharper still. Resistance groups across Belgium, France, Poland, and the Netherlands learned this with blood. Radios did not just attract attention, they created countdowns. Each transmission was a bet: send truth to London or live another week in silence. By 1942, hundreds of Allied wireless operators had been captured. Some were tortured. Some vanished into camps. Some simply disappeared into paperwork and ashes. Still, the radios stayed. Because across occupied Europe, intelligence mattered more than bodies. Because London could not bomb what it could not see. Because generals could not move blind. And because in a war where tanks screamed and skies burned, the quiet men and women behind radios were the only ones telling the truth through walls. Intelligence flowed like blood through wires. Who moved where? When trains ran? What factories built? Which bridges slept unguarded at night? Radios created lifelines between villages in darkness and offices, lit by lamps 3 countries away. And in response, the Germans hunted radios the way armies hunted tanks. With maps. With patrols. With relentless precision. In some countries, entire villages were punished for one signal. In others, radios were buried under floorboards and in bread ovens. Some were hidden in attics, others in wells. But none survived long. Hidden metal still whispered. Batteries died. Operators panicked. Antennas betrayed their homes. Most resistance radios lasted weeks. A few survived months. Almost none endured years. The Germans learned patterns. Timing windows. Signal habits. Even human voice rhythms could be logged. And then the knock came. The radio was always the first thing taken. And then the person. So when a radio survives in one place not for days or months, but for years, the question is no longer technical. It is fateful. Not how it worked, but how it lived while others died. And the answer begins not in London or Berlin, but in a forest that most maps forgot. To understand how any radio could survive across 3 occupied winters, one must first understand how fragile illegal radios really were. The devices smuggled into Nazi Europe were not studio machines or army transceivers mounted in armoured trucks. They were small, imperfect, temperamental constructions built to vanish as much as to transmit. British intelligence services, particularly the Special Operations Executive, dropped them by parachute into fields, rivers and farms, packed in oilskin crates with batteries wrapped in cloth and crystals sealed in wax. These radios were never meant to stay long in one place. They were meant to speak briefly, then disappear. A standard resistance set might weigh 10 kilograms or more, including batteries and cables. The antenna itself could stretch 20 to 30 meters, strung out in attics, woven into clotheslines, or disguised among tree branches. Every transmission window was short by design. 5 minutes was dangerous. 10 minutes was reckless. Longer than that, and a moving German van might begin triangulating the source by the distortion it heard in its headphones. The operator's instructions were clear. Transmit, then dismantle, then move. But that instruction assumed movement was possible. It was not always. Forests burned. Safe houses failed. Roads sealed overnight. Networks collapsed suddenly, with one arrest swelling into 20. Nazi counterintelligence grew skilled at what they called radio games. If they captured an operator, they did not always silence the radio. They used it. Forced transmissions sent false intelligence to London. Messages continued, in the victim's hand, with a pistol just out of frame. Entire resistance circuits were dismantled this way slowly, methodically, letter by letter. Radios did not merely reveal locations. They spread infection. That is why the SOE taught its operators one unbreakable rule: never transmit from the same place twice in a row if you can help it. Never let the enemy hear a pattern. Yet patterns were human. Anxiety forced shortcuts. Fatigue dulled judgment. And winter pinned people in place. German tracking technology was not magic, but it was persistent. Loop antennas atop vehicles could sense direction the way a finger senses warmth from a flame. 3 readings from 3 points could narrow a signal into a neighborhood. A few more and a building could be guessed. Then the building could be tested, slowly, floor by floor, with smaller handheld sets. The method was crude by modern standards, but in wartime conditions it was devastating. A radio operating from a single location for multiple days was almost guaranteed to be discovered. Weeks was improbable. Months was extraordinary. And years bordered on disbelief. Which brings the story not to one particular network at first, but to a question shared by historians and intelligence officers alike. How could a transmitter operate continuously without drawing attention? The answer is not in technology alone. It is in misdirection. The Germans trained specialists to detect signals in cities, apartments, factories, places where electricity hummed and humans belonged. Forests were another matter. A forest is irregular. Bark distorts waves. Moist soil dampens resonance. Tree canopies scatter direction. And the deeper one went, the harder listening became. German intelligence knew this, which is why forests were watched not as signal centers, but as transit routes. Places people crossed. Camps they hid in. They did not expect radios there. Radios were indoor creatures, they believed dependent on warmth, stability, wires stapled to walls. No doctrine focused on hollow logs or moss-covered stumps as communication hubs. And war doctrine, like all human construction, depends on habit as much as intelligence. It is blind where it is confident. And confident the Germans were. By 1943, they believed they had largely strangled underground radio networks. And in cities, they nearly had. In forests, however, the forest worked differently. There were no doors to knock on. No stairwells to climb. Only space, shadow, and weather. A place where everyone listened, yet nothing spoke back. And somewhere inside one such forest, not hidden beneath a floorboard, not sealed behind a plaster wall, but open to frost and insects and rot, something unnatural was happening. A radio was not moving. It was not dying. It was not being hunted. It was simply speaking. Quietly. Regularly. And beyond it, an enemy walked past it every day, unaware that the war was leaking through a wound in wood. The first angle is human, because no radio in wartime ever speaks alone. There is always a person listening in the dark, somewhere not far from the stump, perhaps kilometers away, perhaps only minutes on foot. A wireless operator waits at night for a return signal. The work is solitary. There are no ranks in the forest. No medals. No comrades watching your back. The operator works by memory, by routine, by breath. Fingers adjust dials with the care of a surgeon. Ears strain for distortion, static, interruption. Every night is a gamble. A mistuned frequency can mean detection. A missed broadcast might mean a failed operation. And sleep is the most unreliable ally of all. For many resistance operators, exhaustion did more damage than fear. War at radio scale is not fought with explosions, but with attentiveness. A mind must remain sharper than hunger, colder than winter. And when transmission ends, the operator returns to whatever life can still be lived as a farmer, a clerk, a daughter, a priest, all while knowing one knock could fracture everything. The second angle is tactical, and it belongs to those tasked with stopping it. German guards posted near forests were not fools. They were trained not to the romantic image of war, but to routine. Checkpoints. Ledgers. Passes. Isolation. They learned to read behavior more than terrain. Who walked where? Who avoided eye contact? Who carried bread in a manner that suggested it was not bread alone? Their world was one of human tells. Not dead machinery. A broken radio meant nothing. A stump meant less. Their intelligence world was urban, clerical, paper-driven. Forests were for patrols and hiding bodies, not for sending orders to London. That assumption was not laziness. It was doctrine. And doctrine, when wrong, is invisible to those who live by it. The third angle belongs to the forest itself. Wood absorbs sound. Rain bends waves. Snow dampens vibration. The natural world is indifferent to technology. It does not amplify it. It eats it. A transmitter inside a building ricochets signal through pipes, wires, beams. But a transmitter in soil, in rot, in bark, that is a different war entirely. Signals soften. Edges blur. Bearings weaken. A German van listening for intelligence through a forest might receive nothing but weather. And so what should have screamed instead whispered. And so the place of the radio ceased to be architecture and became landscape. Not a room, but a region. Not an address, but a sense of direction. And when intelligence loses clarity, pattern becomes noise, and noise becomes nothing. The angle is not brilliance alone, it is environment. The resistance did not just hide from the Germans. They dissolved into terrain. And that is a harder trick to unmask. But this story is not yet about a forest used well. It is about an object badly hidden in plain sight. A stump is worthless by definition. Dead wood standing where forests kill and fall every winter. A rotten cylinder is not stolen, guarded, or questioned. No lock protects what looks abandoned. No suspicion is cast on decay. And therein lies the deception. The radio does not hide because it is clever. It hides because it appears useless. It is not buried. It is not defended. It simply exists. Broken. Ignorable. And in war, what is ignored becomes powerful. But war is never static. And nothing stays invisible forever. Especially not a voice that keeps speaking for 3 years. The fourth angle is technical because no illusion survives without engineering beneath it. World War II radios were not the untouchable machines of later decades. They were fussy instruments. They drifted with temperature. They bled power through leaks in insulation. Moisture ruined coils. Batteries aged quickly, especially in the cold. Any transmission inside a stump had to endure frost, insects, mold, and condensation, all natural enemies of copper and circuitry. And yet, resistance engineers were not amateurs. They improvised relentlessly. Wax-sealed joints. Rubber-protected contacts. Glass bottles housed components. A radio concealed in wood could be made resilient if it was treated less as furniture and more as a sealed vessel. Antennas likely did not rise like flags. They crawled. Buried wires could run underground, stretched through root networks or beneath fallen branches, diffused rather than elevated. A human might not see an antenna at all, only another vine. And technology in the forest does not need to dominate to function. It only needs to breathe. The radio would not roar across continents. It would speak in thin lines, at scheduled moments, with signals just strong enough to be heard and no stronger. Weakness was a camouflage. The fifth angle is strategic, and it speaks far beyond the stump. Intelligence is not about volume. One message delivered is as lethal as any bomb if it lands in the right mind. From occupied territory, resistance radios fed London a diet of reality. Not public speeches. Not propaganda. Reality. Which factories ran at night? Which trains carried armor? Which coastal defenses were reinforced, and which were sleeping under rain? Intelligence analysts mapped this data meticulously. Lives often depended on contradictions. If 3 radios reported a bridge unchanged and 1 reported guards, that bridge stayed standing a week longer. That silence saved lives elsewhere. And when a radio survives inside enemy territory for years, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes trusted. Patterns emerge. A voice becomes familiar. An initial transforms into a presence. Command planners know which source is clean. Which one does not exaggerate? Which one has never lied? In that way, a static-filled signal can become more respected than a general. And respect grants influence. Operations changed because of it. Decisions bent. Raids were cancelled or launched in the confidence of that one unseen eye inside the land. And that is the final angle, the ethical one. Because surviving invisibly is not glorious. It is quiet theft from death. While battles filled newspapers and speeches, the radio stole secrets in silence. No thunder accompanied its victories. No flag was raised in its honor. The operator did not cheer when information succeeded. They listened harder, and harder still. Living in such silence for 3 years does something to a soul. You begin to measure time not in seasons but in broadcasts. You celebrate survival not by dates but by routines still intact. War becomes a series of small, almost human goals. Do not break. Do not drift. Do not be noticed. And when you succeed at being invisible for too long, invisibility becomes loneliness. There is no one to praise you. No one to tell you you were brave. No one may even know your name. And yet, the war bends around you. That is the honest weight of clandestine warfare. You bear impact without recognition. You deliver outcomes without witnesses. And the forest accepts you because it accepts everything in time. But the enemy never stops listening. Silence does not mean safety. And one mistake, one careless movement, one curious soldier, one shift in lighting can end a story without warning. Which is why the existence of this radio is not a miracle of construction. It is a miracle of restraint, of staying where no one expects life to operate. But expectation, like war, evolves. And it would change abruptly on a morning when Boots stopped beside the stump and did not immediately turn away. The morning does not announce itself as danger. There is no storm. No sudden shouting. Only Boots. Slow. Measured. Too close. The forest is alive with that subtle sound soldiers make when they are not in a hurry. Leather against frost. Metal against bone. A German patrol is cutting across the wood in an irregular pattern, not hunting for radios. Not on alert, simply moving between points with the unearned comfort of men who believe they already own the place. The stump sits where it always has. Wet. Hollowed. Half-rotten. Forgotten. And that is what has kept it alive for years, its irrelevance. On this day, however, nothing conspires in its favour. A corporal steps closer, his route altered, not by suspicion, but by mud. His heel sinks slightly, annoys him. He moves toward firmer ground. Toward the stump. He sets a boot against the wood to scrape mud from the sole. A careless human gesture. The kind no intelligence report prepares for. Bark flakes under pressure. A piece gives way. And for the first time in years, something inside the stump shifts. Somewhere else in the forest, an operator freezes. The radio, usually faint, stutters once in a soft, brittle whisper, like a breath cut short. The corporal does not hear it, but he feels vibration through his foot. Not strong enough to frighten, only strange enough to invite curiosity. He leans down and touches the wood. The rot is thick. Hollow places give beneath his hand like old bone. He presses once more and hears it then not sound exactly, but sensation. A hum. The forest does not hum. His face tightens. Not in fear, but confusion. Soldiers are trained more against understanding than danger. Danger is loud. Understanding is slow. He knocks the stump once with his knuckle. The sound is wrong. Not fully wood. Not fully empty. Something is inside. Someone else notices him, standing still. A question is called out. He answers with an indifferent gesture. He is only examining decay. The patrol drifts slightly closer. And the radio remains silent because whoever waits beside it knows silence is the only weapon left. A village once died for less. A heartbeat stretches too far. The corporal shifts his foot again and the stump tilts almost imperceptibly. Time thickens. Moments become heavier than minutes. Somewhere in the tree line, the operator imagines boot leather on wire. Fingers on dials. A rifle slung casually over discovery. And this is where war often turns not on battlefields, but on trifles. On a man deciding whether to bother with rot. The corporal squats, pries loose a fragment of dead bark, peers into the dark hole. He sees nothing. Not wood. Not wire. Not dial. Only earth blackness swallowing light. And yet the sensation persists. The hum. It should not be there. It should never be there. A quiet machine is still a machine. And he knows this forest contains nothing of the sort. He rises and glances toward his lieutenant. He does not salute. He does not shout. Suspicion does not behave dramatically. It behaves like weight. A pause. A look. Another pause. And then a decision must be made. Call it in. Or walk away. And in that space, that thin slice of indecision, everything the resistance has gambled for. 3 years presses against one man's patience. The lieutenant does not approach immediately. Rank in the forest is softened by mud and weather. He studies the corporal from several paces away, looking not at the stump, but at the soldier's posture. Not fear. Not alarm. Only mild puzzlement. The corporal gestures again, irritated now, embarrassed by his own uncertainty. He mutters something about rot. About the stump being hollow. The lieutenant steps closer, places a gloved hand on the wood, presses once, listens. There is nothing ordinary about quiet contexts in war. Silence is the loudest thing in the field. But here, it remains just silence. No ticking. No vibration. The radio sealed, shamefully still has gone dead with practiced obedience. The operator has cut power the moment boot touched bark. To transmit now would be suicide. And so the device becomes what it has always impersonated. Nothing. The lieutenant reaches into the hollow with 2 fingers, scraping the wet interior. He withdraws the hand blackened with dirt and fungus. His face tightens in distaste. Nothing in the world is more convincing than disgust. He wipes his glove on his coat. A soldier beside him chuckles. Another taps ash from a cigarette. There is no drama in dismissal, only impatience. He orders the patrol to keep moving. The corporal lingers a heartbeat longer, unsettled not by evidence but by instinct. But instinct is not protocol. And in an army built on written certainty, a feeling is the weakest report of all. He steps away. The stump stands alone again. And in the space where catastrophe almost entered, only wind flows. Elsewhere in the forest, a man or woman does not breathe for a full minute. Then slowly, like blood returning to a limb, motion begins again. Hands do not immediately restore the circuit. There is no rush. The operator waits longer than instinct suggests. 5 minutes. Then 10. The forest must forget before the radio speaks again. That patrolling unit never files a report. There is nothing to report. No enemy contact. No broken rule. No discovery. Doubt rarely survives without proof. But that moment changes everything, even though it changes nothing on paper. From that hour forward, transmissions grow shorter. Frequencies drift. Schedules become irregular. Silence becomes more valuable than confession. Which is the cruel paradox of a successful close call. Survival demands invisibility, but invisibility grows heavier with every breath. The operator now knows the radio can die at any moment, not by intelligence but by accident. Not by sabotage, but by a slipping boot. The machine is no longer miraculous. It is fragile. And with that knowledge, something else arrives. Time. The kind that no one feels until it almost stops. Because every risk taken thereafter is not against the enemy, but against chance. And eventually, chance takes its toll. Not in the forest. Not with boots. But with absence. One winter, the radio simply does not transmit again. No silence is louder to intelligence officers than a voice that disappears. And so the war continues without that whisper. No one searches the forest. No report demands it. And in its hollow, the stump listens alone to a peace it does not yet understand. no official communique ever mentions a stump. No Allied report catalogues bark and rot beside troop movement and steel. Intelligence rarely records its origins in poetry. It enters as numbers, coordinates, observations. And yet, over the years that the forest radio spoke, its messages fed a quiet artery of consequence. Trains reported delayed, caused reschedulings in bomber commands. Bridges noted in condition reports became future wreckage or spared civilians. Factory shifts detected from village windows altered target maps weeks later. The war was not guided by any single radio, but it leaned on many, and the ones that survived longest leaned the most accurately. London never knew the stump. But it knew the voice that returned again and again with information that proved correct. That pattern builds credibility. Credibility builds operational weight. Over time, such sources changed how air raids were timed, how supply lines were judged, how safe zones were estimated. And while no general circled the radio's coordinates like a talisman, the intelligence rippled outward in operational shorthand. German troop concentrations grew clearer. Rail yards were no longer abstract. Roads acquired texture. Forests became more than dark shapes on maps. They became inhabited, watched, alive. But on the German side, nothing changed at all. No branch of counterintelligence documented failure in this region. No officer confessed oversight. Forest patrols remained forest patrols. Radios were still hunted in houses and apartments, not in hollows and soil. In that blindness lived the resistance's advantage. German confidence had settled into a geography that favoured buildings. Thus, an open landscape became private by assumption. And assumption is the most vulnerable structure intelligence can build. In that sense, the radio did more than send information. It demonstrated a flaw not in technology, but in imagination. The Germans failed not because they lacked discipline, but because they trusted the shape of their thinking too deeply. They did not hunt where they did not believe voices belonged. And so they lost conversation after conversation without knowing they had been spoken to at all. After liberation, confirming which radios mattered was nearly impossible. Networks dissolved softly. Operators did not parade. Many never spoke publicly of what they did. Some burned diaries. Others never believed their silence was worth words. Intelligence files, even when declassified decades later, rarely preserve romance. They preserve numbers and code names. Where this radio once lived, paper provides no monument. And yet, the war bears fingerprints not stamped in ink, but in outcome. There are bombing raids better timed than chance. Invasions that met less resistance than expected. Supplies that ran dry earlier than they should have. Some of that belongs to generals. Some to pilots. Some to saboteurs. And some without ceremony to a hum inside wood. But wars do not thank objects. They only move forward. And after the forest fell quiet, no one replaced the radio. No new stump was hollowed. No message asked for. The war had outgrown the region. The front line shifted. Technology advanced. Silence became success. And like many spies who live long enough to be forgotten, the stump simply endured without recognition, weathering peacetime the way it had war unnoticed. And time worked its slow erasure. But it did not erase what the radio had done. It only buried who remembered. And among those left behind, the operator's fate would prove harder to trace than any signal. The war does not end cleanly for those who fight it quietly. Operators do not march home in columns. They emerge alone, often years too late for parades and too early for peace. Records of wireless agents are among the thinnest pages in wartime archives. Many were recruited from nowhere and returned there just as softly. Some were never officially deployed, they simply vanished inside the war and reappeared afterward as civilians who could not explain where the years had gone. The operator behind the stump radio left no signature in history. No photograph has been preserved beside it. No letter survived to confirm identity. This absence is not mystery by design, but by destruction. War eats documentation the way it eats buildings. What is saved must be deliberate. What is forgotten usually was not. But patterns tell what names cannot. Those who ran illegal transmitters rarely lived easily afterward. They had trained themselves to listen more than speak, to trust no one completely, to sleep lightly, to cut existence into hours rather than decades. When such people returned to streets without checkpoints and forests without uniforms, they did not automatically return to life. Normality arrived slowly, like sound after an explosion. For many, silence became unbearable, because silence during the war had always meant safety. And safety never lasts. If the operator lived and probability suggests survival more likely than capture in this case, they may never have spoken publicly. Even decades later, Belgian, French, and Dutch resistance veterans often declined interviews. Not from pride, but from exhaustion. Explaining war without glorifying it is a labor heavier than remembering it privately. Others did speak, but not about machines hidden in wood. They spoke of names lost. Faces gone. Radios were never the story. People were. But it is through small instruments that large things unravel. After the war, German intelligence records were seized and studied by the same people who had once avoided them. Analysts read after-action summaries, wondering where networks had survived longest and why. In forested regions, patterns did not always align with German confidence. Some wireless signals were simply never accounted for. They appear in British logs and vanish from German ones. No capture record. No final report. Just silence after victory. And that silence is as close to proof as clandestine warfare allows. For a radio to survive, the operator must survive. And survival in that trade is a rare triumph. Not of force, but of restraint. Of knowing when to speak less rather than more. The Stump itself did not gain post-war recognition. No plaque marks it. No town guide points it out. It may no longer exist at all. Wood collapses. Earth reclaims. But the idea it held does endure the lesson hidden, not in bark, but in method. That sometimes the safest hiding place is not the deepest one. It is the one no one respects. And as peace replaced occupation, the radio wherever it lies now finished its work without applause. And the war moved on, pretending it had won alone. History remembers what breaks loudly. Cities. Armies. Flags raised and torn down again. But this story belongs to what holds quietly. A forest that never flinched. A machine that never begged attention. A person who spoke only when needed and vanished when silence was safer. The radio in the Stump did not change the war by shouting into it. It changed it by not being noticed at all. That is a harder kind of heroism, one with no audience and no echo. In a century that would later worship encryption and satellites, victory was once carried on breath-thin signals and hands numb from cold, sent from wood and soil to map tables in distant rooms. The machine did not survive because it was strong. It survived because its builders understood weakness was a kind of armor. That invisibility could outperform steel. That irrelevance could outlast guns. The war did not end because of one radio. But the war bent slightly, silently because of many, and because of one that refused to be found. And that is the truth hidden inside this story. That power does not always belong to what dominates the landscape. Sometimes it belongs to what disappears into it. Somewhere, a stump once spoke. And the world listened without ever knowing where the voice was coming from.